Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Sarah Larsen.
Hello.
And Tom Brassington.
Hello.
And together we're going to explore three fundamental areas to the teaching of geography. But first, Tom, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So I've been a bit sneaky. I've got two, if that's okay. I'll be really quick on both of them. So the first is was shared by Jade Pierce on Twitter during her Advent calendar research sharing that she did, and it was fantastic. It's testing pays off twice, and the paper basically talks about the idea that there's a real power in testing and then giving feedback on the test that you do, particularly for retrieval practice. So they take two groups, and one group, so they're both working towards the same final exam, and the first group are given the tests and given feedback from the teacher after that, and the second group were just given the tests, no feedback, and they found that the group with the feedback scored higher. And it was just a really interesting prompt for me, thinking about how retrieval practice is often used in primary. We need to really think hard about making sure it doesn't become a tick box exercise and actually use some of those ideas of how we would assess and give feedback to students in our lessons generally at that particular point within a lesson. And then my second one is just a little bit more geography related. And it's only because I've just started reading it after Christmas and I've kind of got quite hooked. It's a book called Africa is Not a Country by Deepo Faloyan. And all I'll say is it's a really punchy read, and I'm only halfway through, but I found it to be really engaging. And particularly, I think if you're a teacher in your 20s, 30s, 40s, I think you'll see areas of you, parts of your growing up mirrored throughout that story that's being told there. So I'd really recommend that as well. Sarah, what are you reading for?
Well, I've also got two, so I'm glad it's not just me, because it's so hard, isn't it, to narrow it down just to one excellent, well, in my case, book. So I've picked two, and I'm pleased, Tom, that you've talked about the Africa's Not a Country book. I haven't read it yet. It's on my list. I know it's excellent, but along the same lines, actually, one of the books that I'm constantly dipping in and out of is, and I've actually got it here. I know it's going to be back to front, but Factfulness by Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling sadly passed away in 2017. So his, I think it's his son and sister-in-law, I think I've got that the right way around, finished it for him. But it's really similar in terms of the Africa book, Tom, that you've described, which is just busting those myths about people's outdated misconceptions about what lower income countries and newly emerging economies, those less well developed countries, are actually like. And I include myself as a geography teacher. Our subject knowledge can very quickly become outdated as geography teachers, because certainly with development, time moves on very rapidly, and so do these countries. And it's a great visual and written representation of what the world is actually like now, and how much more developed many of these so-called poorer countries actually are compared to what we think they are. And my second book, which I don't have a copy of because I didn't manage to find it in time for the recording of this podcast, is a book called Poverty Safari by a guy called Darren McGarvey. And it's kind of along the same lines, except that it's set in an outer city council estate in Glasgow. And again, that busts a few myths, whereby we are sitting in the UK with this idea that we're a wealthy country, everybody's got a high quality of life and standard of living. That book very much busts that myth and talks about what it is like to be poor living in Britain, and it literally just tells his story of how he grew up and how very, very tricky his upbringing was. And both of those books are books with quite short chapters, and each time I finished a chapter I have to put it down and just kind of take in what I've just read, because it's so mind-blowing on both levels, just to find out what the world is really like on a personal level for those two authors. So both of my books at the moment are geography books, but why not? Because it's my favourite subject, so that was always going to be the case. What are you reading for, Kieran?
Have you read Shuggie Bean?
No.
It's set in, I think, 80s, maybe 90s Glasgow, and it's really, it's semi-autobiographical.
Yes.
Really powerful book.
Right. What's that one called?
Shuggie Bean.
Right, I'm going to look that up. That sounds amazing as well. Yeah.
It's not an easy read, but it sounds like it's long. If you're reading about council estates in Glasgow,
Yeah.
this is going to give you that inside track on.
Urban geography is right up my street, so yes, definitely.
Took a while to get through it. I mean, I don't have a geography example. I mean, I let the side down, but mine is called "Why Learning Mathematics is Hard and What We Can Do to Help," and it's by Stuart Welsh, and it might be my favorite piece that I've read by Stuart, and so I couldn't not share it, even though it'll swell his head to the size of a weather balloon. I'll give a geography reference there. We're going to focus on three fundamental aspects of the teaching of geography. And I think the first place to start is probably with language. Why is language important to the teaching of geography?
When I first started dipping my toes into academic research, I found this paper, which is a paper that isn't in my What You Reading For because it's actually not that great. But it got me thinking about vocabulary. It's by Steve Stork and Steve Sanders, two Steves. And it was all about this idea of the basic premise was that teachers and students need a shared understanding of the language that they are using in the classroom. The example that the two Steves use is around physical education and the idea that teachers might have a very different idea in physical education of what that phrase means to the students that are in their classes. And therefore, there might be a bit of a tension there if they don't have a shared meaning. And that's kind of, like I said, I dipped my toes into that and found that a little bit interesting. But then, reading work from Doug Lemov about the idea, he says that language is really important. Vocabulary is important because it allows you to conceive things, to perceive things, and to grow your knowledge of it in discussion with others. So I think that we probably recognise that vocabulary is important for all subjects. I think specifically where it comes to geography, you've got these three levels that I think of when I think about it, which is this initially the idea of a word by word level understanding. So there's some interesting work by Hilla Spires, I hope I haven't butchered that name, out of North Carolina Uni. And she talks about disciplinary literacy. So the idea being that you're building disciplinary knowledge when you are entwining it with the literacy practices of a particular discipline. So I guess in simple talk, it's the idea that we don't just think like geographers when we're at primary school, but we start to learn what it means to talk and to write like geographers as well. And so that starts with that very specific subject vocabulary, that understanding of those words. And I think often you find in geography, particularly at primary level, children have a real crossover with definitions. And there's a lot of words that have a geographical meaning, but they probably don't know that meaning particularly well. It comes up in a different context in a slightly different way. You kind of get that in maths as well, Kieran, I guess, from time to time. And it's really important that they have a good understanding of that subject-specific vocabulary so that then they can start to begin to communicate these geographical concepts. But then it goes to a sort of sentence level. So I'm thinking about how it kind of plays out for a child across their time in primary school. They're going to learn the meaning of a word. They're going to want to start to embed that into phrases, just like how we learn the sort of English language, I guess. And then as they get more advanced, they're able to kind of access it through text, engage in discourse about it as well. So I think it's really important that when we're considering vocabulary in geography, we're thinking about how we're actually developing them thinking and writing and speaking like geographers. And so, yeah, as you alluded to, Sarah, one of the things that we do at St Modwyn's, it's work that we've done over the past 4 or 5 years now, is establish a bank of shared definitions in geography. And the idea there being that the curriculum model is progression in and of itself. And teachers have a really strong subject knowledge that's better supported by the fact we have a bank of united definitions. Students are able to recognise how that vocabulary kind of contributes to the big curriculum picture, but then also it has so many perks to have this central bank because you have the benefit of documentation and quizzing becoming a lot easier if you have a centralised bank that you can utilise. And really what it does is it gives you a growing understanding that shows progress. So the context in which the words are applied is where the progress is happening. So if you ask a year one what a town is in our school, they'd be able to give you a really clear definition. if you ask a year 5 in our school, they may well give you that same definition, but the examples that they give or the way that they can apply that word in different contexts, it's so much more advanced and a lot greater.
I completely agree, because there's a world of difference, isn't there? Like you've picked out with the year 1 and the year 5 example, there's a world of difference between knowing what a word means, like town, and being able to apply it in the right context, and also being able to recognize it maybe in a piece of writing or the teacher speaking, and pull out what it means and derive meaning from that sentence. And inherent in that is knowing what the key words mean as well. So you're right. And I think I love your idea of having that centralized bank, because of course, I guess at primary level, the majority of teachers aren't geography specialists. Some will be, but the majority won't be. So I guess for you guys, having that centralized bank means you've got that set standard. You're not having to rely on individuals going away and doing their own research and possibly finding incorrect meanings. And then you've got a whole issue with consistency across different classes, perhaps in the same year group and in different year groups. So I guess from my context, I am working with subject specialists, so we don't necessarily have that shared word bank, although what we do is at the start of every unit that we teach, be it Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4, we issue the students with a word bank or a glossary that get stuck into their books, and then they've got that to refer to across the lesson, so they know exactly what keywords are coming up. And absolutely, there are some keywords that are found time and time again across different topics. So I'm thinking about words like sustainability, climate change, development, the more physical geography words, erosion, weathering, transportation, deposition. Those words come up time and time again across many different topics. And so I think thinking about your curriculum sequencing with half an eye at least on the different words that they're going to need to understand, and therefore the concepts, thinking about what you teach and when can really assist or hinder the understanding of your students. So for example, at my school, one of the very first things that we do in year 7 is the unit on development, because there's so many key terms there that if you leave it too late to introduce them, they're not going to make as much sense. They'll have less time to revisit them, and it's going to mean that their understanding of topics that involve knowing what those keywords mean is going to be less. So there's so much involved, isn't there, in terms of curriculum sequencing and when do we introduce those words and when do they see them again and in what contexts. When you're planning a curriculum, that's a really, really important thing to think about. And I think as well, when you've also got subject specialists teaching the curriculum, we have the opposite problem, which is that whole idea of curse of knowledge. So, I can stand there and I can use, particularly with my year 11s, maybe I might sometimes go a little bit too over enthusiastic with them, and I'll start using key terms that maybe they're not familiar with. And I have to rein myself in and kind of think, well, hang on a minute, these students might not know what I mean by, asthenosphere or lithosphere. I've got to make sure that has been embedded before I can just stand there and use those key words. So we have to sometimes, at the other end of the spectrum, rein ourselves in and make sure that the key words we're using are words that are going to add meaning to our students' understanding, and not just because we happen to understand what they're talking about.
When I started looking at vocabulary and geography, one of the things that really came to mind and stood out as I was going into classrooms was that before we did this work, you had a range of different definitions for these key terms that we wanted our children to understand from classroom to classroom. But also, if you went in within a sequence to the same classroom a couple of times, even the individual teacher themselves might use a slight different variation on the definition from week to week. And so the point that we were kind of talking about in our school was, well, if you've got, say, 50 to 60 words that are specifically mentioned in the national curriculum for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, and then you've probably got at least 100 more that they're going to need a bit of an understanding of to be able to access that curriculum. And then each teacher is delivering a different definition of that word. Suddenly you're multiplying the complexity there. And that's not to rob words are complex, and that's one of the beautiful, rich things about our language. You don't want to rob us of that joy that vocabulary brings, but we're a time-stretched sector, and you have to make the smart choices around that. And so we found, it's so interesting hearing how you kind of have the opposite problem with that curse of knowledge, because we found that actually without that subject confidence for our teachers. We just needed something like this that was going to say, right, you're not going to get this wrong if you describe a desert like this. You're going to get it right. And so that took a bit of work to get, and sort of consulting with secondary colleagues and a couple of other people as well to kind of make sure.
What were your sources of information? Did you use the Geographical Association resources at all? Because they've got loads on there for primary teachers, haven't they?
Absolutely, we did. Well, it was really interesting. One of the first pieces of CPD that we did around it, I just said, right, I'm going to give you 5 words that are kind of geography-y, rivers, deserts, the kind of big ones that you'll be able to write about, and just tell me a definition. And so then you'd look at the comparison between people's definitions, and there would always be a bit of correlation, but there would also be some inaccuracy slipping in there, some generalization slipping in there. And sometimes when we looked around in the room, we'd say, there's not the expertise here to be able to say whether that's quite as nuanced as we want. So looking at the GA, contacting our secondary colleagues and saying, does this feel right, is absolutely great. That one of the things that came out of when I was talking at Research Ed Dusseldorf, Shannon dropped me in a bit of bother on Twitter following the talk because she took a screenshot of one of the slides, which was 6 different definitions from teachers when we'd initially said.
I remember that on Twitter, actually. Yes, I remember seeing that.
and so there I was trying to highlight the point that we need to have this bank of shared accurate definitions, and it got a little bit lost in translation.
It was desert. I think it was desert, wasn't it? Yeah, and you had geographers saying none of those are the correct definition of desert, and you were like, yes, that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, it took a little bit of unpacking, but I'm glad to raise my grievance with Shannon one more time.
Brilliant.
Do you find, Sarah, that you're getting even more definitions? Because obviously Tom's talking about it on a class and a school basis. If you're taking in, I mean, you had quite a lot of feeder schools, didn't you, whenever we last spoke?
Yeah, I mean, the majority come from kind of 5, 6, 7 feeder schools, but we do get a lot of kind of individual students that have come from further afield that are just the only child from that school. So it can mount up. Yes, definitely. Oh, completely. They're all coming to us with different, I mean, even from one feeder school, you are going to have, essentially when you've got a class of 30 kids in front of you, you've got 30 different levels of prior knowledge in front of you, and that's one thing. And then actually finding out what that prior knowledge is so that you can build on it and help those that might be slightly more needed than others is another thing. So my love of mini whiteboards and checking for understanding across the lesson and at the start of the lesson is just so invaluable now, because it literally allows you to see inside their brains to see what they know already or what they've retained from the previous lesson. So yeah, very, very mixed levels of prior knowledge for a whole variety of reasons. Yes, very much so.
The next sort of fundamental area is comparing, or perhaps one of the fundamental areas is comparing. What are the key features of a comparative study, and how does this develop across key stages?
This was a lot of what I spoke about in Dusseldorf, actually, the idea of comparison. And I guess comparison is really a really powerful tool for helping to understand our planet, and an effective tool, I think. And certainly I can speak from a primary point of view. I think children enjoy that idea of comparing what their experience of the world with perhaps somebody else's experience, or looking at 2 different places. And even at a very basic sort of key stage 1 level, the similarities and differences, all those sort of things are really powerful. And a lot of the work that we've done at St Modwyn's has been inspired by the work of Vilka and Budka, who have done quite a lot of research around this. And they produced a paper in 2019 that was called Comparison as a Method for Geography Education, which I'll send you the link to put in the show notes, Kieran, because it's an absolute belter of a read. They describe comparison as a bit of a black box for teaching geography, because it goes without question that it will produce results, but you're just not quite sure how it's doing it. So they try to unpack some of the nuts and bolts of how it works. And initially in that paper, they identified 2 ways that you can compare places geographically. So they have a nomothetic comparison and they have an ideographic comparison. So as simply as I can put it, nomothetic comparisons, they seek to establish generalizations. So you might take a group of cities across Britain and look at the results of surveys from those places on like the quality of life for the population there. And then what you would do in a nomothetic comparison is you would compare to try and establish some general principles for what contributes to that quality of life. Whereas for an ideographic sort of comparison, what you're looking for there is a specific point of comparison. So again, you might take the quality of life in a specific place and then look at how that has been brought about to give you some ideas for the comparison. So those 2 points, nomothetic and ideographic, are where Vilker and Budker started, and that gave us some food for thought at St Modwyn's on how we started to put together our comparisons, because the problem for us was that I remember speaking to our Year 5 teacher who just said, when we get to my comparison study, the national curriculum's littered with those opportunities for comparison, particularly in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, they were saying when we get to our comparative study, it just feels like we're either painting with too broad a brushstroke, or we're finding it too difficult to choose something specific to compare. And so what we were I guess the problem we were looking to solve was, how do you compare in a meaningful way within the time constraints of a curriculum that's already pretty jam-packed? So then Vilker and Budker, if I carry on just a little with their method of geographical comparison, they kind of established this method of developing a geographical question. So at the heart of comparison, for us in our school, and we think it's a good model, at the heart of that comparison is some kind of geographical question, a meaty question that they can really explore. And then you're going to start to determine the units of the comparison, defining the variables there, and then weighing up the variables and trying to develop those connections between the units and kind of derive the explanations, is how Vilker and Budker put it. So starting to really analyse what you found out with a view to then evaluate the results and answer the question. And so we found that was quite a helpful model. So we've got a comparison unit in each of our year groups, and now with a little bit more focus from a question that needs to be answered, and also an analysis and a valid explanation for the similarities and differences that the students are coming across, we feel it's a little bit more powerful. So I can give you a couple of examples if that's helpful of sort of some of the questions that we look at. So for example, in year 1, we look at which area of the River Trent that passes under Burton-on-Trent, where we live, that passes under the bridges in Burton-on-Trent is the most dangerous to those who use it. So we're trying to really compare at a local level. And then we take, one of my favourites is in year 5, where we look at homelessness. And the question is, are the trends in homelessness from 2013 to 2023 in London and New York, the 2 places we're comparing, are those trends in homelessness similar? And what's nice about that particular time frame is that we have COVID slap bang in the middle. So we're able to look at some data with our year 5s and really start to get them thinking geographically about the data. I think it's difficult work, and it takes a lot of groundwork at a primary level to make this sort of work meaningful. But if you can root it, as I say, talking from a primary point of view, if you can root it comparison in a really strong question, and you can also ensure that what you are comparing has something to compare and also has an opportunity to contrast as well, then I think you're in a really powerful place then.
That's fascinating to hear how you do it at primary level. At primary, there's a lot of deliberate thought that's gone into your comparison studies, I think, where that is the primary aim of what it is that you're trying to do, and not just, comparisons, but also contrasts as well. That's important, isn't it? That every place is unique, and so it's important to pull out those contrasts, but equally the similarities help the students make connections, perhaps between, that was what I was going to talk about, how we do things with our GCSE. Obviously the content has pretty much been decided for us, although it's still down to us as an individual school to decide which localities to look at. We're kind of tied into what the textbook suggests that we teach as well. The alternative is that we make all of our own resources, and as we've said already, we're time poor as teachers, so it makes sense to use the resources, the excellent resources, which already are in the textbook that we use. But for example, at the start of our geography GCSE, we do a 3-year GCSE at Reigate, where I teach in Surrey. The first half a term for the geographers is, and actually the historians do this as well, is a kind of half-termly unit, which is 50% geography, but it's still 50% history as well. Just because we're a 3-year Key Stage 4, and we like to try and keep both humanities subjects going just for a little bit longer for our students. But what it allows us to do is, for that first half a term, the students do a local study, and they look at Reigate, which is where we live, on a local level. And we look at a lot of themes that are going to come up across the next 3 years, such as what do we mean by urbanisation? What do we mean by sustainable transport? And because we've looked at it at a local level, what it allows us to do is to then, when it comes to the more international case studies, we can draw upon the local study that we did at the very start of the GCSE. So, for example, when we look further afield at Rio or London, we can hark back to the local study to make that direct comparison. Well, what did sustainable transport look like in Reigate? Now let's have a look and see what it's like in London. What's it like in Rio? What's it like in Freiburg in Germany? All of the different localities that we look at. We also think about the different comparisons that we can make between places that might be of different levels of development, for example. So, you know, we're again bound by the national curriculum. So we have to think about decent places to study that will encompass what the GCSE spec wants us to cover. But we pick London, we pick Rio, for example, one of which is far more developed than the other. But again, we're still looking at it through a lens of, well, what are the similar challenges for both of these cities? What are the similar opportunities for both of these cities? What are they getting right? What could one learn from the other? And so teaching them not quite side by side, but one after the other, really allows the students to see those comparisons and to make sense of both of those places in the light of what they learnt about their home locality in Reigate.
Do you find that comparison is a helpful way to avoid those generalizations in geography, or to address misconceptions or stereotypes? Because I think that's what, for me, just thinking about our comparisons at St Modrons, that's one of the most powerful tools we've got to address those, because then we can start to unpick those misconceptions a little bit.
Completely. I mean, certainly. I mean, so we do two urban studies, one for London, one for Rio. I mean, London we deliberately pick because it's our nearest big city. You know, it's a half an hour up the train line up to Victoria. But they've still, you know, not every student has ever actually been to London. So although we're picking it as their kind of locality, so to speak, it's their nearest big city, there are some students in Reigate that have rarely or never been up to Reigate, so they will have these misconceptions based on what they've seen on social media or on the TV. So not only do we have to bust the misconceptions of the further afield places, but yes, we have to bust them in the more local ones as well. But when you're constantly revisiting those same themes, you know, different levels of development, sustainability, hazard management, whatever it might be, you're constantly revisiting those same ideas, what we might call synoptic links through different localities. So yes, I think it does. It helps them understand it because you're revisiting them so many times.
I think it utilises that idea of comparison, utilises something that's almost inherent to us. When we look at an EYFS, when you go into an EYFS classroom, that's one of the things that children are doing all the time. They're always comparing themselves with what other people are doing. They're comparing the different places in their classroom. They're comparing objects. So it almost feels like a natural resource to exploit, to use in that way.
Yeah, completely. No, it does, doesn't it? I haven't thought about it like that. It's what they naturally do. You're right. Yes.
So I mean, it sort of feels like there are a lot of similarities, a lot of common themes running through comparative studies the whole way through school. Like Tom, you're saying about, you know, from the very earliest stages all the way through to the oldest that a student can expect to study geography. Would that be a fair summary of what you guys are talking about?
I think so, because ultimately you're trying to do two things. You're trying to, I mean, apart from getting your students to understand what these places are like and the themes running through, but you're ultimately trying to get them to see what's the same and what's different. So when you boil it all down, that's what you're looking to do when you're comparing two places. You know, what's similar about these places, but equally what's unique, what makes this place unique, and what makes it stand apart from everywhere else. So I think when you boil it down, yes, it does sound like across the key stages we're attempting to do the same thing, which is good. It's always good when there's that continuity.
I mean, and that's always really helpful for primary teachers to know. that you're all working towards the same aims. Because part of me is thinking, when you're talking about those shared definitions, and you're also thinking about the comparative study, we like to have really high expectations. Is there an argument for leaving some headroom so that the jump between key stage 2 and key stage 3, say, is a meaty enough one for those kids? Because quite often in maths, there's almost a non-existent jump. It's either you're repeating the math that you should have learned during primary school, or you're repeating the math that you did learn during primary school sometimes, and perhaps curricula are involved in that as well. What would your preference be, and how much do you consider that, Tom? It's almost two sides of this one coin.
Particularly in the area of comparison, we've tried to. I think we're pushing our students quite far. There's it's quite difficult, but based on that foundation of those shared definitions, based on the groundwork that's almost done in those early stages of Key Stage 1, it feels like an opportunity to embrace rather to miss out. I think just from the conversations I've had with secondary colleagues in the local area, we're fortunate to have some schools that are willing to kind of have those discussions about what transition looks like and what are our children coming up to you that they don't know well enough or they have a misunderstanding about. I think it's vital to try and smooth that transition over as best we can. But also, I think just from hearing Sarah tonight, there's a specificity to the secondary curriculum that isn't there in the primary. It feels as though you really are able to delve into some of these geographical concepts in a little bit more of a meaningful way, because the children are able to access it at that point. I feel like when you think about what our children are doing, so at year 6, our final comparison study, the question is, they look at the modern wonders of the world is what they look at as their final unit in year 6, as a sort of like celebration of all they've learned of geography, and we're able to use that as a sort of way to bring that together. And that question is, are all the modern wonders of the world attracting more tourists since COVID-19? And so they're looking at some data and so when I think about what are year 6 students leaving us with, and how prepared they are to go into year 7, I'd like to think that if they've got that solid understanding of vocabulary that is accurate, that's kind of as best as possible, has avoided any sort of inaccuracies and generalizations, and they've been able to apply it in different contexts throughout our curriculum, with that curriculum being the progress model, I'd like to think we've set them on the right course to be able to access those more specific angles of geography, to be able to start to apply that disciplinary understanding of the subject.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like I've said already, we have students that come to us from quite a wide range of different primary schools. But we also have the issue of year 7 where, and this is just a year 7 thing, I think, certainly at the start, they almost, they're quite timid. They want to please you. They're worried about breaking any rules. The classic one is the year 7 will be, writing in their first page in their exercise book. They get to the bottom of the page and they put their hand up, "Miss, I finished the page. Can I turn over and start the next one, please?" And they're so worried about, getting it wrong at primary school that I think that sometimes translates into, their subject knowledge as well. And things have to be teased out of them to start with. They then start to warm up after a few weeks. Certainly into the spring term, which, we start to see, around about now, I guess, where you start to hear more of, phrases like, "Oh yeah, we did that at primary school. Oh yeah, we did a topic on that." But then the issue with that is you've got a pocket that did a topic on that at their primary school, and then you've got the kind of 20 others that didn't, and you've still got that issue to deal with, I guess. Wouldn't it be lovely if you had a class of 30 that had all come from the same feeder school, and you knew exactly what topics they'd studied, and you could build that into our lesson planning. So we are kind of not planning blind, because we know what the Key Stage 2 curriculum looks like, and we know what they've covered. but it does have to be teased out of them. I think possibly, and this is something that we need to address, that the students come to us almost like it's a fresh start, and that was primary school. Now this is secondary school, so this is our first ever geography lesson, and we're doing geography for the first time. And of course they're not. They've done it, right the way through primary school. But I guess, and you can maybe help me out with this, Tom, I've had 2 children myself go through primary school, but often it was often done through the lens of topic work. So, they might do a project on the Egyptians or the Romans. I remember they once did a topic which was called chocolate, and they had, some rainforest work in there looking at where chocolate came from and where it was grown, but it wasn't necessarily labelled as, right, for the next hour we're going to do some geography. And maybe the students aren't seeing it as such. They're coming to us not realizing quite how much geography they've done, and that's why we do have to tease it out of them. I don't know.
I think there has been a shift, certainly in a lot of schools. I would hope that in a lot of schools there's been that shift since that focus on disciplinary knowledge has come into play. There's been a shift towards trying to ensure that there's a uniqueness to each subject that's taught in primary. I think there are lots of schools still using topic-based approaches, and that's where it's more difficult to sort of celebrate the unique nature of the subject. And I think in particular with geography, you want to make sure that they are able to realise what is geography. They're able to answer that question and be able to see it around. I think looking at the world through that geographical lens is really important. And I'm sure it was Mark Enser who was speaking about the idea that you can, some conversations are shut off to you if you don't have that sort of access to vocabulary. And the example I always give is the one about my pet and my in-laws, who are keen, avid bird watchers, and will sit in a garden and watch birds and be able to talk this whole almost other language that I can't access because I don't have that knowledge. So we want our children to be coming up to you guys in secondary, feeling they've got a place at the table, feeling that they're able to access that with the vocabulary and able to engage in that discourse.
No, I agree, and I think it is Mark Enser that said that. It's in Powerful Geography, isn't it? Yeah, I've written a tiny bit of that book, so that's that's up on my radar because it's one that I've contributed to. Mark's now the subject lead for Ofsted for geography, so obviously he speaks very wise words and always has done. But yeah, I mean, he talks about it, doesn't he? He talks about walking down the high street or looking at a physical landscape and being able to understand what you see before you. Why is the weather doing what it's doing? Why has it suddenly switched to snow today, for example, after having, been quite mild and wet for the last 2 or 3 weeks? Well, knowing about air masses, for example, means you can make sense of weather forecasts, means that you can dress appropriately and not be soaking wet or freezing cold because you aren't able to make sense of, what you can physically see up in the sky yourself and what the weather forecaster is saying. It just, the title of the book is very true. Powerful Geography. It's the power that geography gives you to be able to make sense of the world, whether it be when you switch on the news or when you're walking, around and about in person. It is a very, very powerful subject.
And again, that begins at EYFS, doesn't it? We've looked at a lot of the work by Fran Martin around everyday geography, and that echoes those ideas completely. We want our early years children to be able to say, I need to put a raincoat on because it's raining, and not have to be prompted to do that. And looking for those opportunities for everyday geography is really, really great. It's really exciting to be able to find them.
It is. I'd add, so the Geographical Association, back to them again, because they are amazing. But their theme, let me think, was it 2 years ago now? I think it was 2 years ago. It wasn't last year. Yes, it was 2 years ago. Their theme was everyday geographies, and that was their theme for the year. So that would be 2022, and it was the conference theme as well. I'm certain they're probably still on the website, but there's an awful lot actually about everyday geographies, I would assume at every level, for teachers to dive into. It's fascinating, just the basics of why is this part of my city particularly prone to graffiti or crime, just those everyday experiences still count as geography. It doesn't have to be, the huge volcanic eruptions or the hurricane that's devastated a country. It can just be something on your doorstep is just as powerful because it means that you can make sense of what you're seeing.
I mean, I find it really interesting, Sarah, that you were saying you're using the phrase "what's the same, what's different." because I suppose my final question for this episode is about the ways in which we can vary perhaps the images and examples that we use in geography lessons. So, I mean, this comes obviously, Tom, from something you've spoken about, which sort of lines up with some of my thinkings. This might be one I actually have something to contribute on. But how and why should we vary the images we use in geography lessons?
I would hope that it kind of feeds into the big picture that we've been talking about, in that it's important that students are exposed to a variety of examples of geographical features, that they don't just think of a desert, let's use that example, of a desert as one thing. It's really important. And I think we got to a stage with our curriculum design where we were starting to think there's some real autonomy in our curriculum for what teachers can choose to explore when they're looking at locations. There's autonomy. We use the model for fieldwork that's mentioned in Powerful Geography, actually. David Cole's experiential learning model for fieldwork is what we use. So there's autonomy there for staff to be able to develop that. What we were looking at is when ultimately at a primary level, geography is one of 12, 13, 14 subjects that we have to deliver each week. We have to cut some corners and save some time for our staff. So we got to a stage in our curriculum design where we were able to plan in the opportunities to offer varied examples of specific geographical features. And I did it in a bit of a daft way, really, using Twitter, which, you know, got its pros and cons, but this was definitely a pro in that I was just able to say, right, I want as many images of beaches as you can send me, or as many images of rivers or deserts or wind or all these different ones. If you want to find them, if you put hashtag geographical variations into Twitter, I think I'm the only one using that hashtag. So you'll be able to find them there. And what it opened up for us was this opportunity to say, wow, for our students, they know the River Trent because it's the river that's in their town, but they probably have no idea that rivers can look completely different to that river that they see on their walk into town every day. And so we wanted to offer that opportunity for them to be able to see that and utilize the fact that we have such rich access to images, video, all this sort of stuff that we can use now that perhaps, you know, going back 10, 15 years, it was less easy to get your hands on. And so I think we've just tried to build it in so that we can, coupling it with the shared definitions, we can start to offer insight into the complex shades of these geographical ideas, geographical vocabulary, but also we can start to predict misconceptions that might arise and address them as part of our planning. So one of the things that we do is we've now got some, from building this work into our curriculum, we're now able to say, well, the first time we did this, the first couple of years we did it, there was a real issue around, for example, deserts. People thought that you could never get snow in the desert. We probably need to address that in our planning in some way. And so it's not only kind of benefiting the students to be able to be exposed to that, but it's also informing our planning as well.
It's interesting you bring up deserts, actually, because, you know, even at secondary level, even at GCSE level, students think that the main thing that defines a desert is if it's got sand in it or not. And it's not. It's precipitation, isn't it? If it has under 250 millimeters of rainfall or precipitation, snowfall as well, then it's a desert. So that basically means that Antarctica is the world's biggest desert, and that some students do take a bit of getting to grips with that, because that doesn't have sand, that has snow, but it's a desert. So you're right. So image selection is important, and also pointing out that the most obvious thing in the image isn't necessarily what defines that place or that concept. So it's how you use the image as well, isn't it? And I guess in geography, what we're very used to is annotating images or labeling them, which is a skill in its own right that at GCSE students have to get to grips with as well when they're doing field work. Annotating images, you know, you're not just going to stick a picture of where you went into your work. You need to make sure you're annotating it, you're referring to it. What does that photograph show? also, what are the limitations of any images that you use? Because any photograph, the particular viewpoint has been selected by the photographer. So every photograph is biased because what was going on just behind the photographer, for example, or what was just off camera, what are we not seeing as much as what we are seeing? So all of that has to be borne in mind as well. Something that Mark Enser also talks about, and I don't think it's powerful geography, I think it's making every geography lesson count that he mentions this, is not only selecting a wide range of images, like you spoke about, Tom, where you're looking at different versions of the same thing, so different examples of rivers, but deliberately using the same images across different topics. So, if you're looking at, say, again at GCSE, if you're looking at development in Nigeria, for one topic, and then you come across, or you want to teach your students a different topic where that image of Nigeria that they met maybe a few months ago in a different topic would allow them to make more sense of, use the same photo again within a different topic, because they've seen it before. It allows them to make sense, because we know that children make sense of new knowledge in light of what they know already. So those photos can be used for retrieval. Put it back on the board. When did we last see this? What does this photo tell us? What do we know already? Right, now we're going to find out something else about that place, but it's a familiar place to you because you are remembering that photograph that you saw a few lessons ago or a few months ago. So sometimes using the same photos in succession can really aid their understanding, because it helps them make sense of the world around them. It's funny you said as well, Tom, about how easy we have, or how relatively easy it is to access photos now. I started teaching in 1997, so no internet then. If I wanted to make a worksheet or a resource, it was off to the library. I had to go look in the books, find a decent photograph, photocopy it, cut that out, stick it onto my worksheet, photocopy it again. It was so laborious. So cutting and pasting now, I do have to remind myself how lucky I am, because it's just so quick and easy, isn't it? It's seconds. It's the world is literally at your fingertip, and it takes seconds to find what you want and to copy and paste it. No long walks or drives anymore to the library to have to do it. It was just it literally was another world, and you were just limited by what the books in that library happened to have. There was no massive bank of resources like we have online now. One other thing as well, Tom, you were talking about your bank of images that you built up, which sounds amazing. I want to have a look at that, because that sounds really useful. But another resource that's online, and it's linked with the Factfulness book that I spoke about at the start, which was written by Hans Rosling. Again, it's one of his relatives. I think it's his daughter-in-law, but again, don't quote me, but somebody that kind of works or worked very closely with him has set up a website or an organization called Gapminder. And if you go to their website, within that is a section called Dollar Street, and there is a huge bank of images. The idea being that you type in, a keyword, and it's everyday images as well that children will be able to relate to. So it's different images of what a bed looks like in different countries, rich countries, poor countries, etc. What a toothbrush looks like, what a front door looks like, what a toilet looks like. And you can type in your selected countries. So, you might want to look at what a toilet looks like in Afghanistan, Brazil, and the UK. So 3 different countries at different levels. And, within seconds or less than that, you've got these 3 very different images. And just those 3 photographs can spark off so many great discussions about development, and about, even within different countries, how you might see different examples of those images. And it's so powerful, because the children are looking at what life is like in those 3 different countries, and it just sparks such rich discussions. So I would absolutely recommend the Dollar Street, which is part of the Gapminder. I think it's either institute or foundation, but if you put it into Google, it's easily findable. But yeah, images incredibly powerful in geography, incredibly.
It reminds me a bit of variation theory. I mean, I know, Tom, in your talk, I didn't get to see your talk, unfortunately, but you referenced the Sam Hall blog, where he was talking about the identification of South America, and how varying the images slightly might help people develop their sort of mental model of what South America is. And I sort of took that one step further with my last research ed talk. So me and Neil Almond did a talk on variation theory, and I thought I could do a maths example, but we've seen maths examples. Let's try geography. And I was looking at things like, when do I introduce the Gall-Peter map? When do I introduce a China-centric map, so that when China, because that's really difficult, and then building up towards China centric, but also upside down or inverted, and seeing what can they still identify South America in this as a result. So I mean, when you guys are talking about this, that I'm thinking about there's definitely some thinking to be done about how geography utilizes variation theory, and how teachers can think about the examples they choose. Because I mean, the whole way through that talk, I said, this is what feels most difficult to me. This is the journey I think. And we had some principles about when it's best to jump, to make big jumps and things, but depend on prior knowledge and stuff. But it feels like a conversation that's worth having during planning sessions with colleagues, because if we could draw on the idea that the relationship between similarities and differences is a really powerful aid for pupils' learning, then this feels like you guys are sort of you're in that field. It'd be great to sort of explore it even further.
Yeah, no, I think so. And studying two things side by side as well. For example, when we in year 11 look at the challenge of natural hazards, we deliberately teach two significant earthquakes side by side. So what they both occurred for similar-ish reasons, and there are those similarities, but because they occurred in two very different countries, so Nepal and Chile, which are at very different levels of development to each other, the effects and the responses to those earthquakes were very different, and as a result, the damage was different. The cost was actually more for Chile, and the children query that one as well. They kind of think, well, hang on a minute, Chile's more developed, so why did it cost more to rebuild what Chile had lost compared to what Nepal had lost? Because surely Nepal had more damage and it would have cost more to replace what they lost. But actually, when we then start drawing in prior knowledge about what we know about Chile, they get to grips with why it costs more for Chile to rebuild what they lost, because they lost more to start with. Their gleaming tall skyscrapers needed to be rebuilt. Yes, that's more expensive than what Nepal lost, the much more low-rise basic building. So that's where you've got those differences. So similar causes, but very different effects and responses, and teaching those side by side. So we teach cause for both, and then effects for both, and then responses for both, rather than doing all of one and all of another. And it does allow the students, I think, to make greater meaning, because there are those similarities, but also very, very big differences. And those differences only exist because of the different levels of development of the two countries, despite the fact it's the same natural hazard that they both experienced.
Maybe it was a bit of that in the response to the earthquake in Japan last week, because the response obviously, terrible thing to happen, but it was almost, Japanese are renowned for their disaster infrastructure, and it's almost a case of they've got this covered, compared to if we had an earthquake. we would not have it covered. Is that a fair generalization, or is it an over?
It's interesting though, because it was the 2011, March the 11th, 2011 was the big one that they had, that centered around the city of Sendai. I think off the top of my head, I think it was about 18,000 people that died, wasn't it? And they had the alarms and the warning systems, and they had the sea walls around the edge. It wasn't the earthquake that took most lives, it was the resultant tsunami. But they weren't as prepared as they thought they were, I guess. It's still absolutely devastated. You've still got the issue with the nuclear power plant, which still hasn't been sorted out, because the radioactivity levels are still obviously going to be dangerously high for a very, very long time. But yeah, they are very well prepared, but it just goes to show the power of nature, doesn't it? You can prepare all you like, but that was the fourth strongest earthquake on record ever recorded, and even for the likes of Japan, it was just beyond what they had prepared for. That tsunami was beyond deadly.
It has been fascinating listening to you guys talk about geography all evening. Hopefully the first of many chats where you guys will both join me and sort of hash things out. I mean, because I think we've only really touched on a tiny little aspect of practice, and maybe built on our last chat, Sarah, a little bit more. And hopefully over time we can sort of get an even rounder picture of the subject, because it is great. I love reading about geography. I wish I had more time to teach geography. Maybe not in secondary school. I'm still convinced I'm a primary teacher, but it's been wonderful. So yeah, I really appreciate it. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks very much.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.